So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helen from Rutgers University. It's wonderful to have all of you at this LERA webinar. Tashlin, Lakhani from Ohio State University and I are pleased to be moderators of this webinar on low wage and gig work during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to start with a few reminders. First, this session is being recorded and everything that's said is on the record. Second, there are two ways you can ask a question or make a comment. The first and preferred way is to type your question or comment into the chat window, which is at the bottom of your screen. The second way is to click the raise your hand button. We recommend using the chat window because it helps us to consolidate similar questions. Also, we recommend that you indicate to whom, Janice, Sarah, David Lewin, or David Weil, or all panelists your question is directed to. In both cases, as moderators, Tashlin and I will direct your questions to the panelists, giving preference to the order in which the questions come in. Lastly, we are going to hold questions to the end. There will be plenty of time for Q&A after the speakers have had a chance to present, so please wait till then. Now I'm going to spend 3 minutes for the opening comments. The topic for today's LERA webinar is low wage and gig work during the COVID-19 pandemic. We believe that there are many reasons why this topic is very timely and fundamentally important. Just among these reasons, first, low wage and gig workers hold jobs that are at high risk of income loss. Many of these workers were already living in precarious financial situations before the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has put them in even worse financial situations. Second, low-income workers who are still employed may face healthcare risk due to the essential nature of their works. Those who maintain jobs amid this coronavirus outbreak, such as construction workers, grocery store workers, and delivery drivers, are at increased risk of contracting the virus because they remain exposed to other workers and customers. Many of these workers are low-wage workers and have limited ability to absorb income decline or afford health care costs. Lastly, women, young adults, and groups of color are particularly likely to be low-income workers. Therefore, understanding how the pandemic affects low-income and gig workers help us to better understand income equality and well-being at the societal scale. Without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce our esteemed panelists. We have 4 panelists for today's webinar. We have Janice, professor at Rutgers University, with expertise in immigrant labor, labor standard enforcement, and innovative organizing strategists. Janice is also the Director of Research and Strategy at the Center for Innovation in Worker Organization at Rutgers, a national think and do tank devoted to strengthening worker organizations, where he leads the labor standards enforcement and base building projects. Then we are going to have David Lewin, Professor Emeritus at UCLA, who is an expert in a variety of human resource and labor management policies, including most recently, the misclassification of employees and independent contractors. Third, we are going to have Sarah Thomason, Research and Policy Coordinator at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. She focuses on low-wage work. Some of Sarah's most recent work profiles low-wage frontline essential jobs and worker characteristics in California during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, we are going to have David Weil, Dean and Professor of the Helen School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University, and the former administrator of the Wage and Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor. He is an expert in labor and employment policy, and his most recent work focuses on the effects of fixture workplaces. So I'm really excited for the speakers. I'm going to turn this to Janice first.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Helen, Liu, and Tashlin Lakhani, and also to Joel Gershenfeld for making this happen. It's a thrill to be on this panel with my good friends and colleagues who I respect so much. So I'm going to try to make a big picture argument very quickly, and let's see how it goes. So the good news is that the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act provide new rights to workers for short-term paid time away from work for coronavirus-related health and caregiving reasons, and provide long-term emergency paid family leave for working people. And we know that the law ensures that about 65 million private sector workers, maybe 22 million public sector workers will have up to 2 work weeks of job-protected paid sick days. About that same number will have public sector workers and private sector workers will have paid sick time for childcare purposes. And the bill also provides tax credits to reimburse employers for the cost of wages paid. COVID, everyone has been saying, so but not everyone has said it, so I'll say it, is exposing the cracks in our employment system. Lots of employers don't provide paid sick days or paid family leave. There's a lack of affordable childcare for many low-wage workers, and childcare workers are very poorly paid. There's a lack of affordable healthcare for many low-wage workers, and many healthcare workers are poorly paid. There's a lot of low-wage workers who are falsely misclassified. There's a lot of low-wage workers out there who are not being given the proper PPE. Laws in most jurisdictions don't protect against retaliation. There's no right to refuse work. There's no protection against retaliation for workplace hazards. And the right to organize has been badly eroded, so workers who do take action are unlikely to be protected by a union at their workplace. So the question is this new moment in a policy, but will it be only for some? Will it replicate some of the problems and some of the people who were left out, in the 1930s in the Fair Labor Standards Act, National Labor Relations Act, etc.? On the one hand, it's the most family-friendly 21st century federal law in the country's history. And on the other, it replicates some racial, gender, and income exclusions. It covers self-employed and independent contractors, although through tax credits for the time they're unable to work. It still isn't payroll replacement, so firms can keep workers employed, as in Europe. It doesn't cover undocumented workers who are disproportionately represented in sectors with high percentages of layoffs. And many vulnerable workers are not being provided with PPE. They're not allowed to physically distance enough. They're still afraid to ask for leave. They're still being retaliated against for asking for, if they try not to come back to work too soon, and they're still fighting for hazard pay. And many are struggling to collect unemployment insurance. So I'll just say a few more things. Through the pandemic looking glass, right? These laws exempted large employers, 500 or more. And on the other hand, they exempted small employers, right? 50 or less. So, and we know that there was a major no holds barred lobbying effort on the part of the biggest businesses and business associations to do this. There's a HEROES Act that's trying to fix all this. It's passed the House, but it hasn't passed the Senate. So from where I sit, it's kind of the same old for low-wage workers in the pandemic in some ways. Women of color are disproportionately these frontline healthcare workers. There's large numbers of Black, Latinx workers. Food service workers, are poorly paid, don't have the kinds of things they need. Thanks to Sarah, we got the great idea and replicated the study that they did in California and New Jersey. That will be available to people. I won't go through it now. I'll just say 2 last things. In terms of enforcement, some states and localities are trying to go further on the policy side to make up for the gaps in the federal relief packages, but only partially on enforcement. The demand for unemployment insurance is taking up a huge amount of capacity for state agencies. Old computer systems from years of underinvesting are slowing things down enormously. The shift to work from home has been very hard for agencies. Of course, it's harder and more challenging to investigate. Still, some are trying to prioritize COVID-19 related claims, but we are heading into a major recession, depression, and we will have a huge challenge on our hands. Violations will be way up, and the fiscal crisis of the state means resources will be way down. And what do we see at this moment? We see President Trump coming out with an executive order on regulatory relief to support economic recovery, right? There is going to be a fight about whether to answer this crisis with getting rid of regulation and with saying that we can't govern the market, and that we should lay off of firms, and that we should not engage in enforcement. I want to argue lax enforcement is not the answer. It will lower wage standards, and it will mean that we will end up with lower wage standards. So a twofold strategy is strategic enforcement, and I'm talking with the person on this panel who invented it, to target sectors that are most likely to violate the law. And second, co-enforcement partnerships with trusted organizations. And we need more support for business. And we need to make sure that enforcement and support for business are linked in some ways, but it cannot be at the cost of lowered wage standards, and saying that business models that structurally are cheating workers are excusable because of the recession, because the economy we have is what we'll end up with. Thank you.
You're muted, Helen.
Great, thanks, Janice. Now we are going to turn to David Lewin.
I've turned the stopwatch feature on my iPhone on to try to restrain myself in terms of time. For today's webinar, I want to focus on a development, a recent one in California. And it has to do with a law that was passed last September and signed by the Governor Newsom, which is aimed very specifically at drivers for rideshare and delivery companies. And this law follows a couple-year-old California State Supreme Court decision that set a new three-pronged standard for determining whether an independent contractor is in fact an independent contractor or an employee. And that so-called ABC test, the B, says that a contractor must be performing work that is different from, independent from the main business of a company, if it's a company, or a nonprofit organization, if it's a nonprofit. And by that standard, most independent contractors would have to become employees. The law is as interesting for who it is aimed at and who it excludes. And the exclusions, these days called carve-outs, include not just doctors and lawyers and all people in professional services jobs, but as well tow truck drivers, nail salon employees, contractors really, journalists, who 3 months after the law was passed successfully got an amendment to exclude them from coverage because newspapers and many media organizations immediately began to end their contracts with stringers and others who are on independent contracting relationships. The law is therefore aimed specifically at drivers for rideshare and delivery companies. Interestingly, it also is aimed at drivers who deliver goods to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and that is a huge matter. There are 3 lawsuits now by companies who use those independent contractors. What I want to call some attention to, however, is something that we see from time to time in a new law or a long-standing law, which is potential unanticipated consequences. About 40% of the independent contractor drivers for the rideshare and delivery companies, and this is just in California, hold other, or at least before the COVID pandemic, held other full-time jobs. So they were generating W-2 tax income for the state of California and 1099 independent contractor income for the state of California. And I mention this income tax aspect because the main motivator for the state of California in enacting this law was a claim made by the state's Employee Development Department and other state agencies that California was losing, quote unquote, $7 billion annually because independent contractors for the rideshare and delivery companies were not covered by payroll taxes. So California, I think, has been the most aggressive of all states in getting taxable income. When you file your income tax return for the federal government, at least, you still write a check. In California, you go online and you must pay it immediately at that moment and file your return on the due date. Also, you probably know that California was the only state in the union that for just under a decade ran large budget surpluses. And its ability to handle the tremendous fallout from COVID-19 is at least in part cushioned by that $50 billion surplus that had been accumulated over the past 10 years. So California's motivation for this law, at least for the state, was to enhance revenue, tax revenue, and they think it can be done through independent contractors for these companies becoming employees. But about 40%, as I say, of these independent contractor drivers hold other full-time jobs, or did. Could they continue to do that if they became regular employees of these rideshare and delivery companies? Probably not. Another 20 to 25% of these drivers hold part-time jobs elsewhere. Of the remaining, let's say roughly 30%, about half are students who seek income to offset their expenses at colleges and universities and their loans. And the other half of that half, say 15%, are retirees, many of whom are receiving pensions, but who want to supplement their income. And many of these retirees have dependents that they have to support financially. So have here is that more than 1 million individuals in 2018 actually drove for the rideshare and delivery companies. If those people must become employees, then you have to estimate what the elasticity of demand is going to be, the prices for the rideshare and delivery services. And estimates that we think are reasonably valid suggest quite a high elasticity of demand, meaning there could be a substantial reduction in consumer demand for these services, and thus a substantial reduction in the proportion of people who are driving. And those estimates can get pretty high. So there is this potential for unintended consequences of the law, and I'll stop there.
There is a lot of information out there and would love to know more. Thanks, David. Now I'm going to turn this to Sarah Thomason.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to first share my screen so you can see my slides. How's that? Yeah? Okay, great. So my name is Sarah Thomason, and I'm a researcher at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be on this panel and hear from everyone today. I would like to share the approach that we have been taking to look at low-wage work in California during the pandemic, some findings from initial analysis that we have done, and also some of the questions that we would like to explore in our future research. We have focused primarily on two groups affected by the pandemic. The first is unemployed workers. Here in California, service workers were hit the hardest in the first wave of layoffs. For example, the largest union of hotel workers, Unite Here, reports that 98% of their members have lost their jobs. The second group is essential workers, such as grocery store workers, who are still employed, but are at higher risk of exposure to the virus. Like many other researchers, we have been working on identifying these two groups of workers in our data in order to learn more about who they are, but it has been challenging to try to produce analysis that reflects what is happening right now when things are changing so quickly. We don't have great data. The data sources we typically rely on are somewhat outdated by the time they're released. And the makeup of these two groups is changing from week to week as the state changes who counts as an essential worker, and the job loss is spread out to more industries and occupations. This has made it really difficult to get at a count of workers that are impacted, which we know would be really useful for policymakers right now. Despite these challenges, we have done some analysis of demographics and job quality for these workers in a series of blog posts released by the Labor Center. We have found that the effects of the pandemic have not been equally distributed across California's labor force. Both unemployed workers and essential workers in California are disproportionately low-wage earners, workers of color, and young workers. At this point, our research efforts have barely scratched the surface of understanding what this pandemic means for work and workers. I want to touch on some of the research questions that we think will be useful to help policymakers and worker advocates be strategic in their responses to the pandemic and the economic crisis. And we are seeing that these questions fall into two buckets. The first is economic impacts. How is the pandemic shifting the labor market? For example, when businesses start to ramp back up, will they shift toward contingent work and temporary hiring? Will we see fundamental shifts in the distribution of jobs across industry and occupation? Is the pandemic going to speed up some transitions that were already underway, such as a move towards online retail? And we want to know how these changes are going to impact job quality, inequality across race and ethnicity, and immigration status, and which are going to be temporary and which are going to be long-term. The second bucket of questions is around worker health impacts. It is clear that infection and mortality rates are higher for people of color. The question that remains is, how much does workplace exposure explain that difference? We are also interested in exploring which workers are most at risk, not just right now, but also once the shelter-in-place orders are lifted and we move into a different phase of the pandemic. So those are the questions that we are thinking about. I'm really interested to hear about any research that you all have done related to these and any additional questions that you think will be important moving forward.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Now we are going to have our fourth presenter for today. So David Weil from Brandeis University. I'm going to turn this to David.
Thank you, Helen, and thanks to Tashlin and Joel for convening this panel and this series. So what I'd like to do is talk about some of the short-term policies that have been put together to deal particularly with the gig workers in the pandemic, and then take a longer-term view. I think Janice really nicely laid out the fundamental issues that have been revealed by the pandemic, but pre-existed the pandemic in regards to the gig workers. And fundamentally is the fact that businesses have restructured themselves, and organizations beyond businesses, including the government, in terms of how we actually contract people to do work. And one of the fundamental issues that I think we have to really wrestle with in terms of responding to the problems, particularly faced by gig workers, in the short and the long term, come back to the basic question about what do we expect protections to look like for both sets of workers, and how do we move forward. We also have to think about the reality that the conditions affecting gig workers and the way work has been transformed have spilled outward and have had impacts on the larger wage structure in our economy. So what affects directly gig workers, whether as independent contractors or in complex fissured kinds of relationships, don't end on the boundaries of that work, but actually have impacts on larger labor markets. In our discussion, I'd be happy to talk about a current research project where we're actually documenting some of those spillover effects. But that context is really important in understanding short and long-term response. In terms of the short-term response, again, as I think Janice pointed out, there's some good news in the packages that government has passed, Congress has passed since the crisis began in the FFCRA and in the CARES Act. The good news is the FFCRA finally puts our country with every other nation on the earth, save one, in providing some kind of paid sick days and paid leave for working people. And the CARES Act, particularly in the creation of the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, creates a larger boundary of unemployment assistance for workers. So that's very much the good news and should be commended. Problematic, and this affects gig workers, and this affects really all workers under both acts. For the FFCRA, it's not so much what Congress did, it's what the Labor Department and the Trump administration have failed to do in the implementation of FFCRA. The regs that have come out of the Labor Department are overly restrictive, have made it very difficult for workers to actually apply and get the kind of relief that are envisioned in the Act, and actually create far too many loopholes, even for covered employers to get out of that coverage, even when it's in their interest to be in that coverage through the tax subsidies that Act provides. Secondly, the Labor Department has completely failed to provide the broad kind of guidance and publicity that's necessary to roll out a new regulation or act. I know from my experience in sitting in that chair how important outreach is to both the employer and worker community. There's been a significant failure of that for FFCRA. The CARES Act, and particularly a pandemic unemployment assistance, the good news is it did try to address for the first time the fact that many of the workers affected would not normally be covered by our unemployment assistance program. The challenge is we now have 43 states who have provided PUA benefits, and that's been a big increase over the time that they've existed over the last 2 months. But the failure is, or the problem is, we have an incredibly decentralized unemployment assistance system that really consists of 50 different programs. This dates back to the New Deal passage of unemployment assistance, but it's made the rollout of that very inconsistent and varied across the country. I think it shows the need for a longer term addressing our entire way we do unemployment compensation, not just in terms of coverage, but also in terms of the administration of that. So that's particular to those two acts. I think the other thing we are really seeing now, particularly as we are in this moment of bringing people back into the workforce, are the problems attendant with our health and safety system. We have far too many workers who are going back into workplaces that are simply not equipped to protect them from the pandemic. And again, this is very true for gig workers, but it's true for workers in general. A lot of that failing you can lay at the feet, once again, of this administration's policies, the failure to provide for emergency standards, requiring employers not to follow guidance, but to actually be required to put in place the kinds of protections that the OSHA Act demands. But this is an area where I would get into a set of longer term policy issues that I think the pandemic has revealed and that we really need to think about, and I hope we can talk about. And that is the gig workers, too many workers who have fallen outside of our protections. We have to address that set of issues, not just through the kinds of strategic enforcement policies that are out there, but by a fundamental reconsideration of how we do our workplace policies in general. What I would advocate, and there is a policy proposal paper that a colleague of mine, Tanya Goldman, and I have written, where we argue for what we call a concentric circle model of workplace protections and rights. It begins by saying there are certain core rights that a worker should be assured of, regardless of their employment status, that are fundamental to what we as a society regard as how people should be treated. That begins with health and safety. That begins by saying a workplace, regardless if people walk into it, should be provided certain kinds of health and safety benefits. That a workplace should be free of sexual harassment or other forms of discrimination. That a workplace should provide a worker the right to complain and protections for the rights to complain. And that a workplace should provide workers with payment for the work they do. regardless of whether they are there as a legitimate independent contractor or an employee. Let's get to a set of core principles around what is inviolable when someone is doing work for another party. On the next kind of tier of that circle, I would strongly contest some of the assertions my colleague David Lewin made about independent contracting. I think we need to move to a system where, for a wider set of protections, we make the presumption of employment, and that one has to overcome the presumption of employment to treat people as independent contractors. There are independent contractors in this world, and they should be treated as entrepreneurs who take certain risks. But it should be up to the organization that is employing them to make that case. We can talk about what the criteria is, whether AB5 has it precisely right or not. But I think there is a huge issue about the failure of so many labor laws in making that distinction and the large number of workers misclassified. Let's get that right in the next tier. And then finally, in the outer tier, I would argue that you want to provide people access to the kinds of benefits that we provide through worker compensation, unemployment assistance, and newer kinds of benefits like paid leave, whether or not workers are independent contractors or employees. We want to give access to those kinds of rights, maybe through different mechanisms, but let's take the issue of benefits provision and separate it from employment protections. I think in that larger canvas and in that longer term view, we can start to get a handle on the problems that have been revealed in such a stark way by the current pandemic crisis. Thank you.
Great. That was fantastic. Thank you to all of the panelists for your comments and your thoughts. I think we'll have a very lively discussion today. So before I turn to the audience Q&A, do any of our other panelists want to comment on each other's presentations? I can give you a minute or two just to make some final thoughts before we turn to many of the great comments that we're already receiving from the audience. If you do, just put up your hand.
There
Yeah, David?
The point about individual states and how they behave in this area compared to the national government, which is one of the things that David Weil commented about, is, I think, quite fundamental because it touches so many other issues involving the principle of states' rights versus the rights of the central government. And if you happen to live in a state that is progressive and has supplemented what the federal government is doing, you're better off as a worker or as a contractor. But if you live in another state that simply doesn't do that, then you are worse off. And I'm reminded, I'm going to use one other example. In the countries that I have visited, to the best of my knowledge, they all have one national driver's license. You don't have to get a new license if you move from one province in Canada to another after 90 days, or a canton in Switzerland. In the US, we have 50 states with their departments of motor vehicles, each of whom has jurisdiction over a driver's license. And if you move to another state, you eventually have to get one. That's something that, just like paid sick leave, which every other country but the US has, we don't have. And it's this balance between national policy and the role of the federal government and state policy. Now, when we have a national government that has been described here as simply not enforcing existing regulations and backing off of them, then you probably favor strong states' rights. But more generally, I think this issue of the over-reliance on states' rights for so many issues, especially in labor and employment, is, I think, a really key issue for the short and long term.
Yeah, Janice. Oh, you're muted, Janice.
Sorry, I really want to get to the audience, but David, I think the major reason that we've seen such an uptick in policy at the state and local level is because federal policy has been blocked for such a long time. It's not like people have decided they like state and local policy better. It's that it's been very, very difficult to expand labor and employment protections, to update our labor relations laws and our Fair Labor Standards Act through Congress and through the president. So people have been doing, their best to try to compensate for that at the state and local level. And the fact that you're sitting in California, which is so much blazing the trail, leading the way on so much innovative work, including AB5, in my opinion, and then saying, what you're saying, I think is unfortunate, because I think it's a very positive thing that this is happening, and that it's about politics, right? If politics were different, then different things would be possible at the federal level. But under Democrats and Republicans alike, labor has not been a priority. It has been very difficult to get the political will to substantially update our Fair Labor Standards Act and our National Labor Relations Act. So people have turned very effectively, I think, and are blazing a trail at the state and local level. All the paid sick and safe time, paid family leave, fair scheduling, ban the box, higher minimum wage. These things have been done at the state and local level. And hopefully, when the political situation shifts, and when workers and their allies have the kind of power they need to have, then things will be possible at the federal level. I'll just say that one of the things that was so interesting to me watching the Democratic presidential debate was that for the first time, all of these candidates actually talked about the right to organize, right? And really made the decline of the labor movement a central explanation for the rise of inequality, and talked in much more particulars, and came out with long policy proposals about how they would strengthen unions. So I was very encouraged by that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, David.
So I would just build on that, because I think it's one of the things that's interesting to think about the future of labor policy. And I would quote the namesake of my university, Lewis Brandeis, who thought a lot about the relationships between state and federal policy. And the fact that states, as we all know, he had this famous statement about that states are the laboratories of democracy, the place experimentation happens. Lewis Brandeis is actually the first person that I think also talked about races to the bottom. He had a famous dissent in the early 1900s where he talked about states cutting taxes to kind of drive things down, and the consequences of that. I think when I think about the relationship, I actually think of something I've called ratcheting federalism. That what one can have, and I think we're going to see a period of this, is where the divergence between states can actually pull things up, where they become so much divergence that ultimately a federal law can bring things up to the next level. That's been the history of minimum wages in this country, where states are allowed to pass a minimum wage above and beyond the federal minimum wage. It's only when you get a profusion of state minimum wages that exceed the federal minimum wage that historically you break the logjam and actually raise the federal minimum wage. I think we can see that in other areas of the policies that are being experimented with, that in a different political climate might result in an improvement in federal regulation in general.
Okay, great. So let's turn to some audience questions. I think we have a lot of interest in a lot of what we've been talking about. There's some questions around what David Lewin talked about with independent contractors, but we've had some panelists comment on that. So I'm going to actually circle around to some questions that are more broadly to the panelists overall, and then we can always circle back to some of the questions regarding the classification of independent contractors versus employees time pending. So we have a question from, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, but Shayla Campbell. This is a question for the panelists. The focus today is clearly on current low wage and precarious work. I'm interested in your thoughts on the potential of the pandemic to create a new wave of workers at risk, especially in the professions. Professions have multiple loyalties and levels of regulation and protection. The regulatory bodies are not neutral, though they claim to protect variously the public interest and the interests of their members. Cyber work for lawyers, for example, disproportionately impacts women in a negative manner. So panelists, what are your thoughts about this question? David Weil.
Well, I think it has revealed again, changes that were underway, but I think people didn't adequately understand that some of this breakup of the employment relationship has been moving up the skill ladder. Most striking about that is a number of cases involving emergency room physicians who are employed through staffing agencies who have been laid off in the course of the pandemic because of their outspokenness about the dangers facing people in healthcare institutions on the front line of COVID. There was a well-documented case of a Dr. Ming Lin who was working in Washington State in the forefront of this, who publicly came out about concerns he had about his hospital organization where he had worked for 17 years. And he was reassigned to oblivion, not by the hospital, by the organization that he actually worked for, a company called Team Health that was doing staffing there. It's turned out that these kinds of staffing arrangements in emergency room, which were originally intended for dealing with peak demand problems and rural kinds of facilities, have expanded and become far more common in healthcare organizations. I think there are other examples we could talk about of other parts of the healthcare sector where you have actually shifted out work in a variety of ways that presents not only dangers to the workers in those relationships, but also the danger of things like cross-infection and getting control of the kinds of conditions that can quickly spread a problem from a workforce to a patient base and backwards, back to the workforce.
Any other panelists? David Lewin.
The question reminds me, and the law firm example does so in particular. This is, I think, a potentially big deal with tens of millions of people working at home and not working in their offices. And with many of them being quoted daily in the media saying, when something returns to near normal, I think I'd prefer to work from home, especially if I have a long commute. The question of whether we're going to see a return to quote unquote normal working relationships with people near each other in offices is a very big question. And if it turns out to be that law firms and other professional service firms and other kinds of companies and public organizations and nonprofits stand in favor of working from home, how do you regulate safety and health at the home compared to the workplace? This is just one of many of these kinds of questions. A related point I would make, and because of our panel here, is universities are facing the huge question of whether students, millions of them, may choose to remain online rather than return to campus. This is an area of forecasting that almost any forecast is illegitimate at this point, but it tells you that the higher education sector is facing, I think, a fundamental challenge, including what to do with those facilities if more and more students prefer online versus in-class attendance. So this is a really, I think, quite a big deal, this working at home from several perspectives.
Janice.
Yeah, I'll just say that in my completely unscientific sample, I've been very happy to know that many students that I talk to really prefer in-class instruction and have really not enjoyed this last semester. That being said, yeah, I think, people have talked about, the response at our university at Rutgers, instead of it being to lift up our teaching faculty and to say that actually, if we want to get back to teaching, we should have smaller class sizes. And that means, supporting our adjunct faculty. Instead, they're laying them off, right? That's 30% of our teaching faculty during a pandemic, right? I mean, it's not only unethical in terms of our own, how it's impacting, our brothers and sisters who are adjunct faculty. But the other thing is that it's just exactly opposite of what one would imagine if you want to reopen campuses to do. I hear from professional workers all the time, particularly state professional workers, that they sort of feel like they're being forced to go back to work, and they're not at all convinced that they're going to be protected. And the science shows that it's indoors, right? That people in spaces that people are more likely to get infected. So again, I think that what we know from health and safety studies is that we want to encourage people to feel like they can, stop the line, and I mean that metaphorically, right? That we want people to speak up. If they feel that conditions are unsafe personally, they're probably unsafe for all of their coworkers, right? And that means that we need protections that are not in place now. We need a 24-hour hotline, right, for people to be able to call. We need to make sure that there are, trusted organizations that are in a position to support those workers and to work in partnership with agencies on how to provide support to those workers. There needs to be a substantive right to refuse, a rebuttable presumption, right, that if retaliation happens within 90 days, we can assume that it's because they spoke up. So, I mean, I think that there's a set of interesting things coming out of the states. Look at Minnesota and what Minnesota has done about right to refuse. Look at California. Look at Chicago and what Chicago is proposing. In New Jersey, we have an executive order that's up around these health and safety issues. But there's no question that professionals, are absolutely, that a whole new waves of professionals are going to be placed in terrible jeopardy, and that we are not prepared for this. And the answer is not, relaxing regulation.
Okay, great. This was fantastic. We have a related comment or question that builds, I think, on some of what Janice was just talking about from two individuals. One is Christopher Martin, and the second is Margot Feinberg. And these questions are around workers' comp during COVID-19. So Christopher asks, have gig workers been successful, or what chances would they have of being successful in demonstrating that they got COVID-19 on the job for workers' comp? And Margot followed up suggesting or asking whether, can we have achieved a presumption for workers regarding COVID being work-related for workers' comp, including those who should be classified as workers, such as drivers and food delivery? What are your thoughts on this? Margot, did you have something you wanted to add?
Can you hear me? I don't know. I was saying we did it.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, we achieved it. It's not mine wasn't a question. Mine was an answer that we got that presumption here in California. No problem. So if anyone wants to see it, but we achieved that here in California, that there's a presumption under workers' comp that you achieved it on the job. And here in California, of course, we take the position that these these drivers are workers under workers' comp. So I was just answering the question, and I'm happy to share that with anybody.
Oh, sorry, you can't hear me. Yep. So I guess the question then is, is this likely everywhere? What are your thoughts on how this will apply more broadly? David?
I would reiterate what I was saying about the PUA and the fact that we have 50 different programs. This applies equally to workers' compensation. And unfortunately, oh, I'm echoing. Many of the work. That's me. I don't know if other people are muted, but I'm hearing an echo. Sorry. The workers' compensation system in so many states is so broken as well, both in terms of what employers have to pay into it, and certainly in terms of coverage and the adequacy of that coverage. And I think, and certainly the fact that actually the way misclassification is often identified is when workers come in to claim workers' comp, and they are informed at that point in time that they've been given a 1099 and they're not even part of the system. So I think the very positive things that happen in California, this is a case where we have to figure out how do you bring those much more comprehensively across the country, where a lot of workers will have huge problems in claiming COVID-related costs.
Any other panelists want to comment your thoughts on this question? Yeah, David Lewin.
It just takes us back to this question of the role of the central government versus the role of the states. In most other countries, again, using the paid sick leave example, something like workers' comp, there are federal standards and the states don't have the degrees of freedom that they have in this country. So California may be in the lead in this area, and it is, and other states are real laggards. So are we going to ratchet up to something better as David Weil was suggesting the possibility of, or is it still a race to the bottom in some places at least?
Great. Okay, so another question from Tim Newman was, beyond traditional labor and employment law, are there other mechanisms or fields to provide greater protections for gig workers to address the range of issues they face? For example, privacy legislation. Thoughts on this? Janice, I see your head nodding. Do you have comments on this or a response? No? Anyone else? No? Yeah, David?
Well, as California has been used for several examples here in this webinar, we also have a new privacy law that went into effect on January 1 to ostensibly provide additional protection for both consumers and workers. So if one wants to look for another California-based example, that would be one in response to the question that was raised.
Great. Okay, so this question is specifically for David Weil from Anil Verma, and the question is, the idea of graded rights is a good one, but will it lead to complicated jurisprudence to determine which group one falls in as contentious parties dispute every ruling?
Well, you know, I think that's an attendant problem of law. I mean, that's why we have lawyers. There are always gray areas, you know. You can go back to the 1930s, the famous case involving newsboys and whether they were independent contractors or employees. You know, there have always, the law is intended, and judges are empowered to kind of deal with these threshold issues. I think so I wouldn't say that the sort of the concentric circle model will solve all problems. I think what you want are cleaner lines. What strikes me about AB5 is that it provides a cleaner line to delineate where do you stand? You know, I think there's an interesting debate to have. Does AB5 have the ABCs exactly right? You know, that's an interesting question. So you establish that line so it is as clean as possible. But I think that's the way we go. What worries me are, you know, these proposals about third ways, that somehow creating something between employees and contractors is going to get us out of this box. That's just going to create two new areas of gray. And I think, unfortunately, given the nature of our law and our jurisprudence, it will push far too many more workers into the kind of independent contractor box.
Yeah, sorry, David, we're just gonna, do you guys mind if we go to one last question before we wrap up? It looks like we're running out of time, but I wanna make sure that we've tried to cover as many questions as possible. So for one more minute, we have a question from David, and I can't pronounce your last name, so I'm not going to try. But the question relates to something that some of the panelists were talking about earlier, but and I think Janice was mentioning some of this, but how do contingent faculty and student workers fit into your analysis of the COVID bailout's impact on such workers and the employers of them? So maybe a minute or two on this before we wrap up with some concluding thoughts. Janice?
Well, I'll just say, I think in general, you know, this is a confusing time for industrial relations specialists and for labor historians, right? Because we think that workers achieve the most and organize the most in good times, and that in bad times, you know, they don't, right? That's what we know from like the long waves of capitalism and history of organizing. And yet, what are we seeing? Tons of striking and wildcat stuff and lots of gig workers who are walking out, and you know, lots of activity. And, you know, either we're gonna, you know, go, you know, sort of be proven correct, or we're writing a new chapter. And I think that, you know, the word that hasn't been spoken enough in this conversation is power, right? It's about power. And so, you know, things that have, you know, that we know were impossible before and were banned by the law only became possible when workers asserted rights they didn't have. And I think that that's true for public sector workers. We know that's true. We know it's true with the red state, you know, teacher strikes. You know, all the walkouts that we're seeing now we're going to see new law being made. The future is unfolding before our eyes, and I think it's, I'm not Pollyanna about it, right? I'm really worried that there's going to be lots and lots of activity, but because our labor laws are so broken, we don't know what kinds of, permanent organization and permanent institutions are going to be built. But I think people are out there pushing the limits, and I'm very inspired and excited by it.
Great. Any last comments from any of our panelists about this topic? David, Lewin?
Just want to point out that in US colleges and universities, about half the people who teach in classrooms are adjuncts and lecturers. Their pay runs about a quarter to 33% of that of a regular faculty member. And this has developed in the last 30 years as these same colleges and universities have raised their tuition substantially. So if you want a leading example of at least a two-tier, if not multiple tier beyond that system of work in this country, higher education is a leading example.
Great. So thank you to everyone who attended this session. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions. I encourage the panelists to go back through the chat when you have some time, read through some of the really interesting questions that have been posed, and I encourage you to connect offline as well. We do have 3 minutes to wrap up, so I'm going to give the panelists a chance just to take 30 seconds or 60 seconds just with any last concluding thoughts before we end today's session. So anyone want to start? Janice, do you want to take a shot? Is there anything any last concluding thoughts? No? Pass. Anyone else? David, David Weil, David Lewin, Sarah, anyone want to sort of conclude with some final thoughts about today's topic?
I vote for Sarah.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the really great comments that people have added into the chat. And I also wanted to offer up, if anyone else is interested in replicating the study that we have done for here in California in another state, I'm more than happy to share my code and walk through the methods that we used.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. David Weil, David Lewin, any last thoughts?
Well, I would just make an observation about when we come out of this pandemic, and we will at some moment, we're going to face a new workplace that will be in part defined by the things we've just experienced, as well as these longer term problems. I think often there's a tendency to overstate what new laws will do in terms of the viability of businesses. And I think what one really wants to make sure we do when we reconsider federal labor policies is to create a set of policies that really reflect our aspirations about how we want people treated in the workplace. I think if we do that clearly and make them enforceable, businesses will adapt. This is always the history. Businesses always will say the world is going to collapse and there will be no more people who will do this kind of work if we comply with laws that really reflect social norms about what we want to happen. I think we're going to see that again in the next phase, where I hope we really respond to some of the problems that this panel's discussed.
Great. Thank you, David. David Lewin.
Just want to say, if those who have attended this webinar and the prior LERA webinars like the sort of format and what you're hearing, keep in mind that the entire LERA annual meeting, June 13th to 16th, is going to be online, and some of these very issues will be covered. So I'd encourage anyone and everyone to attend that meeting on a virtual basis.
Great. Thanks, everyone. It looks like we have 1 minute left, so it looks like we were right on time. Thank you all for participating. Thank you to LERA, to Joel, to Wilma, Emily, everyone at LERA for your hard work in putting this together, and all of our panelists as well. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Let me ask the panelists just to stay on for a minute. So people are signing off, but there's still some on.